Hi, I'm the history guy. I have a degree in history and I love history, and if you love history too, well then this is the channel for you. On October 19th, 1781, nearly 8,000 troops under the command of British General Charles Cornwallis surrendered to the combined American-French army under the command of George Washington on the Yorktown Peninsula in Virginia. It was the greatest defeat of the British Army in the American Revolutionary War, and while the war would drag on for another couple of years, the surrender of Cornwallis meant essentially the end of land operations in the colonies and that shift in Parliament where they came to the conclusion that the cost of trying to keep the colonies was simply too much. And while the Battle of Yorktown is pretty well known, much less well known is the naval battle that occurred at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay about a month earlier that made the siege of Yorktown possible. It wasn't a massive battle by any standard. Only one ship was eventually sunk, and yet it was the decisive battle in the American Revolution, and it deserves to be remembered. In 1780, George Washington, who was then substantially reinforced by the French army, had a decision to make. They could either move against the forces of General Sir Henry Clinton in New York, or they could go south and attack the forces of Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis in Virginia. Now, both offered risk, but Washington preferred New York. And the reason was that Cornwallis had fortified a peninsula in Virginia called Yorktown that was a deep-water port, and so attacking there would be useless, he reasoned, since the British fleet could just come down and evacuate Cornwallis and his troops. But the French general that was with Washington had a trick up his sleeve. He asked for the assistance of the French admiral in charge of the fleet in the West Indies, Admiral Francois DeGrasse. DeGrasse offered to bring up his fleet to the Americas as well as a substantial number of French troops, but they would have to return to the West Indies by October. DeGrasse could therefore cut off the British fleet and prevent them from evacuating Cornwallis. DeGrasse's fleet left their base on the island of Hispaniola on August 15th, but DeGrasse had a problem. There were substantial British fleets in the West Indies that were looking for DeGrasse, and so in order to keep from being spied, he had to travel a more dangerous route outside of normal shipping lanes. He arrived at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay on August 30th. In fact, there was a smaller fleet from the West Indies looking for DeGrasse, but as they took the direct route, they didn't see DeGrasse, and so, by the end of August, the British fleets from the West Indies and New York had combined and had received news that DeGrasse was at Chesapeake Bay. The pickets from both navies sighted each other on September 5th, and DeGrasse was caught pretty much by surprise. He hadn't expected the British that soon. His ships were still offloading troops, and so many of his officers and sailors were still on shore, and in the hurry to get to sea, many of his ships had to leave undermanned. Also, because they were leaving the bay disordered, that put DeGrasse at a disadvantage. But the British commander, Admiral Sir Thomas Graves, failed to take advantage of the situation. In the tactics of the day, what you would do is line your fleet in a line, and the two ships' lines would cross each other and shoot. And Graves spent so much time trying to get his own ships in a line that he gave DeGrasse time to get his ships in a line as well. But the two fleets were approaching at an angle, which meant that the ships in the front were able to engage first. Graves tried to give some orders to dress his line and get the rear engaged, but he gave confusing orders that actually ended up exacerbating the problem. And so most of the battle was fought just between a few ships at the front of the line. After 2 hours of fighting, the results were inconclusive. Both sides had taken damage, neither one had lost a ship, but the British had taken more damage than the French. The two fleets floated down the coast for another couple of days, looking at each other, but Graves was reluctant to attack because he had so many ships that were so damaged. And so on September 10th, DeGrasse returned to the Chesapeake, where he was reinforced by a smaller French fleet that had sailed down from Rhode Island. By the time that Graves returned to the Chesapeake, he realized that he did not have enough ships in enough shape to be able to take on the French fleet that size, and so he was forced to sail back to New York and make repairs. By keeping Graves from reinforcing or evacuating Cornwallis, DeGrasse had guaranteed Cornwallis's defeat. Graves was not even able to get his ships repaired enough to leave New York until October 19th, the same day that Cornwallis surrendered to Washington. It was a short but decisive battle, and what really explains what happened at the Battle of the Chesapeake? Well, Admiral Graves deserves quite a lot of criticism. He was unable to capitalize on his initial advantage. He had the opportunity to surround and outnumber the French van, but he spent so much time trying to get his own ships in order, and his fleet was so confused by his confusing orders that he was not able to take advantage and wasn't even able to get the rear of his fleet engaged in the fight. But DeGrasse deserves a lot of credit. When he got the note from the French general, Lieutenant General Rochambeau in America, DeGrasse had no orders from France. And still, without orders, he took his entire fleet, abandoned his post defending French interests in the West Indies, sailed by a more dangerous route in order to avoid the British fleet in the middle of the Atlantic hurricane season, and then came to America and fought one of the most decisive battles in history. Even the troops he brought weren't his. He had borrowed them from West Indies garrisons without permission. And the reason that he had to get back to the West Indies in October was to give back his borrowed troops. But another person looms large, and that is John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich and the First Lord of the British Navy from 1771 to 1782. Now, Montagu is a controversial figure. He did do some good things while he was in charge of the British Navy, but the Navy during his period was notorious for graft and inefficiency, and that certainly impacted Graves. For example, the single ship that was sunk through the entire battle was the British ship the Terrible, and it had to be scuttled after the battle because it was taking on so much water that the pumps could not handle it. But reportedly, the Terrible was in such disrepair that it was taking on almost as much water before the battle as it took after the battle. In fact, Graves' ships were in such terrible repair that he couldn't sail at full speed, which is what kept him from getting to the Chesapeake ahead of DeGrasse. And after the battle, when he had to seek repairs, the difficulty in supply and even paying for repairs meant that he could not get his fleet back to sea in time to rescue Cornwallis. It was the inefficiency of the British Navy under Montagu that was the real reason that Cornwallis could not be saved by the Royal Navy. And so the great irony is that the decisive battle of the American Revolution was fought between the British and the French with no Americans involved. And while it was a small battle with less than 500 casualties, it was incredibly important. Historian Michael Lewis describes it this way: it was one of the decisive battles of history. Before the Battle of the Chesapeake, the United States was a possibility. After the Battle of the Chesapeake, the United States was a certainty. Now, DeGrasse was later defeated by the British fleets in the West Indies and captured by the British, but it was his initiative in 1781 that earned the Americans their independence. And ironically for the British, it was really the incompetence of their own officers and their own command that cost them the war for American independence. And yet all three of these people, Admiral Graves, Admiral DeGrasse, and John Montagu, deserve to be remembered, because without them, there might not be a United States of America. I'm the History Guy. I hope you enjoyed this edition of my channel. 5 minutes of history, short snippets of forgotten history, 5 to 10 minutes long. If you did enjoy it, then please go ahead and click that thumbs up button that's on your left. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to write them in the comment section and I will be happy to respond. And if you'd like 5 more minutes of forgotten history, all you need to do is to click that subscribe button that's there on your right.